Our text for this morning is the story of Judah and Tamar, as we find it recorded for us in Genesis 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Kezeb when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up," for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, taking off her veil and put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim on the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also the men of that place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." And as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. The grass withers and the flower fades, but surely the word of our God stands firm and sure forevermore. Well, loved ones, the chapter that's before us this morning is certainly an uncomfortable one. So much so that my initial inclination had been to skip over it and to just continue on with Joseph's story as it continues to unfold in chapter 39. And yet here we are, just having read through this difficult passage together. And we've done that because skipping over these events, well, that would have significantly diminished our understanding of both Joseph's story and the greater story of salvation of which it is a part. And why is that so? Well, it turns out that there are a number of very practical reasons for not being able to skip over this chapter. And the first of those reasons is that this isn't just Joseph's story. That's something that we learned about last time when we were together, and we spoke about how in the closing chapters of Genesis, what we find recorded there is the story not just of Joseph, but the story of the generations of Jacob. And so we've learned that this really is a family history that's being recounted to us. And this isn't just any family, because this is Father Abraham's family. And so this is the family that's graciously received the covenant promises of God. This is the family through which God has intended to bless all the families of the earth. And so it is essential for us to be aware of how God worked in their lives so that this family as a unit could become a blessing to us. And this alerts us to the second practical reason for not bypassing this account. And that's the need to explain the radical change of heart that Judah undergoes as this story unfolds. And in that respect, we recall how last time in our study of chapter 37, we encountered a man who was so callous and so hard-hearted that he was prepared to sell his own brother into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. But take up your Bible, if you would, for a moment and turn with me to chapter 43. And let's look for a moment at chapter 43, and let's read verse 8 together. Chapter 43 and verse 8. This has happened after the brothers have been down to Egypt for the first time. They've encountered Joseph, and Joseph has insisted that they can't return unless they bring their brother Benjamin with them. And Jacob is very distressed by this thought. And here is what Judah has to say in verse 8. And Judah said to Israel his father, "Send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall requite him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would now have returned twice." What we have here, brothers and sisters, is a remarkable change in character. Judah has gone from a man who was willing to sell his brother to a man who is now willing to offer his own life in his brother's place. And we have got to wonder what could possibly have caused such a radical change of heart. And we're not going to be able to answer that question if we haven't wrestled with what happens here in chapter 38. Because if we did, we would be missing a critical part of Judah's story. And we wouldn't just be missing an important part of Judah's story, we would also be missing an essential part of Jesus' story as well. And that is something that would become clear to us the moment that we came to the first words of the New Testament and we encountered the genealogy that we find right at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. Because in the opening sections of that genealogy, we suddenly discover that Judah is one of the forebearers of King Jesus, which means that Judah is one from the line of royal descent. And notably, it's not just Judah's name that gets mentioned, because there is Tamar's name as well. Tamar, who is one of only 4 women whose names are specifically recorded in Jesus' family tree. And that alerts us to the fact that Tamar Tamar isn't just a mother in Israel. Tamar was one of the mothers of Israel's great king. And Genesis 38, it tells us the story of how God caused her to become part of that royal line of descent that leads to Jesus. Knowing that Genesis 38 is a critical moment in the story that leads us to Christ, it also alerts us to the final practical reason for not being able to skip over this story. And that is the recognition that since these things are really part of the Christ story, that means that this is really a tale of grace. It reminds us that even the sordid events of this chapter are part and parcel of the great story of salvation that God is telling. And we know that because grace is the only way that anyone can become a living part of Jesus' family. Loved ones, Judah and Tamar, they became forebearers of the king by grace. It was by grace that they were made partakers of God's covenant promises. And it was by grace that God worked in their lives in such a way that he not only overcame their sin and rebellion, but he used those things in the service of his great plan of redemption. And what was true for them is also true for everyone whom God draws out of the darkness of sin and into fellowship with himself. Understand that there is not one sinner who has become part of the family of God by any other means than the grace of God. And it is the presence of that grace here in the midst of the darkness of this story. It's the presence of that grace that makes it unskippable. There's a message of hope for us here, hope that we can't live without. And so, under the direction of God's Word and Spirit, we are going to seek that hope out together this morning. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to go on a journey. In order to do that, we're going to have to follow along with Judah as he traveled the long way home. And as we do, we want to see that Judah's journey home, it was going to involve four things. It was going to begin with a defiant departure. It was going to lead into a deep darkness. It was going to involve a determined deception, but it was ultimately going to result in a divine deliverance. So a defiant departure, a deep darkness, a determined deception, and a divine deliverance. Now, our story begins with a defiant departure. And that is what happened when Judah decided that he had had enough of his family and that he was going to try and make a new life for himself amongst the Canaanites. Now, we aren't told exactly what circumstances precipitated Judah's departure, but given the way that the previous chapter ended, it isn't hard to imagine that Jacob's refusal to be comforted for the loss of the son that Judah had sold, that might have created circumstances that became untenable for Judah and might have created circumstances that he just didn't want to deal with. But while the reasons for his departure might not be entirely clear, the irony of the situation is far too obvious to be overlooked. Just consider the differences between Joseph's circumstances and Judah's circumstances. Because Joseph's departure from the family, well, that had been a departure that had been entirely unwilling. That hadn't been a voluntary leaving. No, Joseph, he had had to be ripped away from his family by the deceit of his brothers. But that wasn't the case for Judah. No, Judah, he makes a conscious and a deliberate choice to leave his family in order to venture out into the world on his own. And in this, we can see that Judah is behaving much like his uncle Esau. Esau, who had loved a good meal more than he had loved the blessings of the Lord. Now, while Joseph's supposed death had torn this family apart, Judah's departure, well, that left the unity of this family in utter shambles. And it's no coincidence the way that this chapter begins and ends, because the chapter begins and ends with a tearing. It begins and ends with a breach, with a breakout. And we see that in the way that Judah departed. And let's be clear, Judah's decision to leave, it was very much an act of defiance. We know that because of what Moses tells us about the way he left. Moses tells us that Judah went down and that he turned aside. And those aren't just geographical details. No, those are very much a spiritual commentary on the state of Judah's heart. And it's a sad commentary indeed, because Moses gives us a window into Judah's heart by telling us where Judah went and also by telling us what Judah did when he got there. Now, where Judah went was into the care and into the company of his Canaanite neighbors. And he didn't just hang out with these folks. No, the text tells us that Judah, he sojourned with them. He put down his tent there. He made these people his own people. And what he did was to marry one of those people. He solidified his relationship with these Canaanite neighbors by marrying the daughter of a man named Shua. Now, we don't know that woman's name, and that is an indication that who she was didn't matter nearly as much to Judah as what she looked like. Indeed, Moses tells us that when it came to Shua's daughter, Judah saw her, he took her, and he went into her. And that seems to be about all that mattered to him in this relationship. This then was a man who had decided that he was done living within what he perceived to be the restrictive confines of the covenant community, and that from now on he was going to make his own rules, and that he was going to live his own life according to the dictates of his own heart. Now maybe as you've been listening to these things, you found yourself feeling somewhat sympathetic towards Judah's decision. And perhaps that's because lately you've been thinking along similar lines yourself. In fact, it might even be the case that the experience of life within the family, of life within the church of God, that has left you wondering whether you might be better served by cutting ties and heading out on your own. It might even be the case that you have some Canaanite friends who are encouraging you in this. That there are unbelievers with whom you have grown close, and that those unbelievers are calling out to you to leave this family behind and perhaps journey off and make a new start with them. Well, if that is the case, then please don't leave. Please don't leave until you have heard the end of the story, because we haven't just been told where Judah went, and we haven't just been told what Judah did. We have also been told a great deal about how that new life unfolded for him. And what we learn is that Judah's path, it didn't lead him into the freedom and into the satisfaction that he'd imagined. No, quite the opposite. His defiant departure, it ended up leading him down into darkness, a very deep darkness indeed. And that darkness, it manifested itself in Judah's life in two very significant ways. And the first manifestation of darkness in this family, it comes in the form of death. Now, Judah doesn't die, but just about everyone connected to him did. The first person to pass was his eldest son, And all that we can say here is that must have been exceedingly wicked. And he must have been exceedingly wicked because is the very first person in the Scriptures to be individually singled out to fall beneath the wrath of the living God. Was followed in death by his younger brother Onan. And in this case, we do have a much clearer sense of why it was that Onan fell beneath God's wrath. And what we know is that Onan had refused to fulfill the obligation of what we now call levirate marriage. Now, it's called a levirate marriage because levir is the Latin word for brother-in-law. And in ancient times, if a married man died without an heir, then his younger brother was expected to marry his widow. And if that couple was blessed with children, then the oldest son that they had, that son would be legally recognized as being the deceased brother's son. Now that might sound a little bit strange to us, but we need to understand that levirate marriage, it was intended to function as a way of honoring both the deceased brother and the wife. It honored the deceased brother by preserving his family line and lineage, and it honored the brother's widow by assuring her of her place in the family and by providing her with children who would protect her and care for her when they grew up. And that is all well and good. That system will work just fine so long as the younger brother was prepared to honor his brother and sister-in-law in this way. But that wasn't something that Onan was prepared to do. And his refusal to care for them, well, that was a refusal that was predicated upon Onan's greed. You see, according to the customs of the time, the oldest son would always receive a double portion of the inheritance. And in the case of his death, that right to inherit that double portion, it would flow down to his son. But if he didn't have a son, then that double portion of the inheritance, it would be given to the next oldest brother. And in that case, that meant that it would have been Onan who inherited that double portion. And so as far as Onan was concerned, was dead, and he needed to stay that way. Now that did not stop Onan from using Tamar for his own sexual gratification, but it did stop him from fulfilling his obligation to his family. And God, who sees the things that no one else sees, God who sees the things that are done in private, God who sees the things that are done in the heart, God saw and he knew what Onan was doing. And God understood that because of who Judah was and because of the promises that Judah's family had received, that Onan's behavior, his refusal to meet those familial obligations, that wasn't just an insult to the honor of the family. This was actually an attack on Judah's family line. And because God saw this behavior for what it really was, he intervenes in judgment, and he slew Onan for his iniquity. And preserving the family line, well, that became a matter of real urgency, because the text tells us that sometime after Onan had died, Judah's wife, Shua's daughter, she died as well. And that left Judah with just one remaining child. He had one remaining son, a boy named Shelah. And Judah clearly had some concerns about Shelah's survival, because although he promised Tamar that she would be able to marry Shelah when he came of age, Judah never made good on that promise. And his refusal to do that, it indicates that the darkness which had manifested itself in Judah's life, while this wasn't just the darkness of death, no, this was also the darkness that had filled Judah's own heart. And the darkness that had taken hold of that heart, it was a darkness of spiritual blindness. It was a darkness of profound self-righteousness. Now, the condition of that self-righteousness, that is a condition that we can diagnose from Judah's refusal to marry Shelah to Tamar. Now, why did Judah refuse to do that? Well, he refused to do that because in his estimation, Tamar was the problem. Had married Tamar, died. Onan married Tamar, Onan died. And in that sense, Judah seems to have looked at this situation and said, well, clearly the problem here is Tamar. But it never seems to have dawned on Judah that it was his son's flagrant wickedness that had brought about their judgment. Instead, Judah blindly concluded that Tamar was somehow at fault. And this is why he takes Tamar and shuts her up in her father's house and refuses to honor his promise to let her marry Shelah. But the true depth of the darkness that had filled Judah's heart, it wasn't just a matter of spiritual blindness. It was actually a matter of a profound sense of self-righteousness. Because how did he react when he heard that Tamar was with child? Well, without any investigation, without any questioning, without any evidence of care or compassion, he immediately calls for her to be put to death. And when we hear him respond that way, we just about want to pick up our Bibles and shout through the pages of Scripture and demand that Judah just stop and think about the fact that he was prepared to execute his daughter-in-law for the very same transgressions that he was guilty of. Make no mistake about it, loved ones. Verse 24 is unequivocally the lowest point of Judah's spiritual descent. In that moment, he was completely lost. He was lost in the darkness of sin. He was held in the grip of death. He was consumed by a sense of self-righteousness. This is a man who was utterly lost in darkness and in the futility of his own mind. We've got to understand that this is precisely the point to which a defiant departure will lead us. I mentioned a moment ago that maybe you might be thinking about leaving the family of God. Well, if you are, then let's be 100% clear about this. When we are living in ways that are governed by the lustful desires of our own hearts, then we are always going to be traveling a pathway that only leads to one destination, and that is a place of darkness. That is a place of death. It is a place of lostness and futility. And that's where Judah had gone down. This is the life to which Judah had determinedly chosen to turn aside to. And yet, Judah won't be lost in that darkness. He's not going to stay there. He's not going to remain there. Why? Because, well, Judah might have decided that he was done with God and that he was done with God's covenant promises. It is precisely on account of those covenant promises that God had decided that he wasn't done with Judah. In fact, God had decided that not only was he going to drag Judah out of that darkness, but he was going to bring Judah back home. And in God's providence, Judah's journey home, well, that would necessitate him falling prey to a very determined deception. Now, that plan of deception, that's a plan that was executed by his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Tamar, who in contrast to Judah's wife, Tamar, whose name we know. And we don't just know her name from Genesis 38, we know her name from Matthew 1 as well. And the fact that we know her name from those sources, it tells us that Tamar's personal character is a critical component to this story. Tamar, who since the time of Onan's death had been shut up like a prisoner in her father's house, we need to understand that Tamar is essentially trapped there. She's trapped by the fact that she had been formally betrothed to Shelah. And because she had been formally betrothed to him, publicly betrothed to him, she could not give herself to another man. And yet the man whom she has been promised isn't being given to her. Tamar, who though she had been denied both affection and justice, had no legal means of pressing her claim. And not only did she have no legal recourse of pressing her claim, as a woman in an ancient society, even if she could have made a legal case, she lacked the power and ability to prosecute that case. But Tamar, like the persistent widow in Jesus' parable, refused to allow her demand for justice to go unheard. Now, to be clear, the Scriptures, they do not condone the specific methods that Tamar used to obtain that justice. And we know that the Scriptures don't condone this because of the context in which this is set. Again, this is why we can't skip this particular chapter in the story of Joseph, because the sordid sexual details of Genesis 38, they are set in stark contrast to the example of sexual purity that Joseph will give us in the coming chapters. And so we've got to be clear about the fact that believers can never justify using wicked means to achieve righteous ends. Still less should we ever claim that God causes bad things to become good things. That's just not the case. Bad things are still bad things. Sinful things always remain sinful. And so we shouldn't ever claim that God somehow sanctifies our bad behavior. That isn't what the Scriptures teach. But what they do teach us is that God is strong enough, but He is also wise enough to govern things in such a way that our wicked and sinful deeds, those things end up being co-opted in such a way that they end up serving God's good purposes. And that's exactly what happens in our text. Tamar's trapped. She is. She's absolutely trapped. And she lacked any conventional means of seeking the justice that she rightly deserved. And in those circumstances, Tamar determines to deceive. And she decided that since the men of this family had already treated her like a prostitute, that she would embrace that role and use it to her benefit. And notably, in devising this plan, Tamar acted on her awareness of Judah's weakness. She acts on her understanding of Judah's proclivity to fall into sexual sin. And when Judah of all people condemned her to the flames for her apparent promiscuity, well, as the young people would say, Tamar showed up, and she showed up with the receipts. And in the presence of those receipts, the cord and the staff and the signet, in the presence of those receipts, Judah was confronted not just with the fact that he was the father, but he was confronted with the reality that Tamar had been more righteous than he had. What does Judah mean by that? What he means is that in the midst of this darkness, Tamar had been the only one who had clearly seen the need for justice. She had clearly seen what was right. She understood what justice was. And although she might not have used the right means of getting it, she used the means that were available to her. And she pursues justice. And all the while that she has seen clearly, Judah has been blind. He's been utterly blind to the fact that he was actually the cause of all the suffering and injustice that Tamar had endured. But in that moment of confrontation, the scales fall off of Judah's eyes, so to speak. And when they did, he finally sees things clearly. And in the moment that he sees things clearly, he does the only honest thing that he could have done. He says to all who are there, and he says to Tamar, she is more righteous than I. She's got it right, and I've had it wrong the entire time. Crucially, however, that honest admission of his own unrighteousness, that was the first crack. And that's the key here, brothers and sisters. We need to understand that this is the very first crack in a very hard heart. And that crack is irrefutable evidence that in faithfulness to the promises that he had made to this family, God had continued to be at work in Judah's life. And so what we find here is irrefutable evidence of God's plan, his plan of divine deliverance. Now, God's plan was to bring Judah home again. And God's plan didn't just involve physically getting Judah back home. God's plan was to bring him home spiritually as well. But in order for that to be accomplished, God needed to change Judah. He needed to change Judah's heart. He needed to change Judah's perception of himself and his circumstances. Because you see, Judah thought that he was at home. Judah thought he was home there amidst the Canaanites. Judah thought that he had a family. He thought that he was living his best life now. And most of all, Judah thought that in the midst of all of this, he was somehow a righteous man. And Judah needed to know that none of that was true. In fact, what he needed to know is that he was a long way from home, so far distant from home that he was lost in the darkness of misery, lost in the darkness of death and his own unrighteousness. And the only way of altering Judah's perception was to bring him into an honest confrontation with himself. And that's precisely what the Lord does here in this passage. And in that sense, it's not really Tamar who shows up with the receipts. It's God who shows up with the receipts. It was God who governed over these circumstances in such a way that at the lowest point of his life, that Judah is finally able to see clearly. He's finally able to see himself for who he really is. Now, that isn't a pleasant process. It's not a process that's going to happen without pain, without discomfort, without grief. It never does. But as the Catechism tells us, it is this confrontation with the profound lostness of our hearts. It's that confrontation that's essential because that is the first step in the process of reconciliation. That is the first stage of God's unfolding plan of deliverance for sinners. That hard, painful confrontation with who we really are. That's the first step on the long journey home. And in God's providence, Judah finished that journey. He finishes the journey that he begins in this chapter. We know that because he goes home. He goes back to his family. And he goes back as a different man. There's a clue here in our chapter to that effect. We're told that after Judah had been confronted by Tamar, and he had acknowledged that he was the father, he did not know her again. Now, at one level, we might say to ourselves, well, okay, he didn't know her again because of the scandal. I mean, how scandalous would it have been? He's already been caught having fornicated with his daughter-in-law. And, I mean, why compound that? But I think there's more to it than that. He did not know her again. This is a man who, up to this point, had shown no sexual restraint of any kind. But he did not know her again. He did not take Tamar for himself. We know then that this is a man who has been changed by this confrontation with Tamar in his own heart, and we see the fruit of that change. We see the fruit of that change being borne out in chapter 43. Think about it. This is a man who has gone from selling his brother to offering his life in the place of his brother. It is the fruit of the change of a repentant heart that has been worked in him by God, and God then brought Judah home. And in so doing, he delivered him. He delivered him from all of his lostness and unrighteousness. But the amazing thing about this story is that God didn't just do this for Judah's sake. No, loved ones, he accomplished this mighty work so that every repentant sinner would be able to go home. He did this so that every single one of us would have a way back. And we know that because this chapter, it doesn't end with Judah's honest confession. It's a chapter that actually ends with the description of a family, the family that Judah received when Tamar gave birth to twin boys, Perez and Zerah. And those are names that aren't lost either, because we encounter them later in the scriptures. Because we find that Perez and Zerah are mentioned in the genealogy that we just read from Matthew 1. And we don't just find him there, we actually find him in between. There's another place that we find Perez. We find him in the genealogy that's located at the end of the book of Ruth. We find him there as well. And what we realize then is that we hear of Perez so that we can hear of David, and we hear of David so that we can hear of Jesus. Perez becomes part of the genealogy and the lineage of the king. And as we meditate on that, we come to understand that God brought Judah home, not just so that he could personally be delivered out of darkness, but so that his sons could be delivered from death as well. And the death that Perez and Zerah needed to be delivered from was the death that inevitably would have overcome them if they had not gone down to Egypt with Jacob and his family during those long years of famine. God saves Judah so that the family can go down and be reunited under Joseph and saved by the preparations that God has allowed Joseph to make for that time of suffering. And Perez needed to live so that in due course he could have a family that would wind its way down to David, and from David to Joseph, and from Joseph to Jesus. And so this story is really the story of how God delivered Judah so that he could deliver Perez, and through him bring about the line of the king, and to bring about then salvation. And thus, this is the story of how God was working to bringing about deliverance, not just for Judah, but for every single person who in faith would acknowledge the lostness of their condition and who would turn to the Son of David for the provision of a greater righteousness. It's interesting, right? You think about Judah's conversion. How does it occur? It occurs through an encounter with a greater righteousness than his own. We need that encounter. We need to encounter the righteousness of the Lord Jesus Christ. And we need to understand that that righteousness can become ours through faith in him. And all of this means that the true wonder of this story is that in the gracious of provision of God, there is a way home again. There is a way to have your fellowship with God and with the family of God restored. Look, maybe you're here today. And maybe you're here and you're sitting in this pew, and right now your life is a mess. And maybe it's the case that you have wandered far from home. And maybe during the course of your wanderings, you've sinned grievously. Maybe you've sinned grievously against your family, and you've sinned grievously against God. Well, if that is the case, and in some way it is true for all of us, if that is the case, then hear the wonderful message of this text. And know and believe that no matter how far you have traveled, no matter how grievously you have sinned, there is a way home. You can come back. And that is possible because God has made a way of return. He's made a way of return in Judah's son. Judah, of all people. Judah, that wicked man who sold his brother and who took his wife and who enslaved his daughter-in-law before he slept with her. Judah. And yet God delivered him. And God can do that because his might and power are greater than our sin. God can do that because his love and his compassion and his sympathy are greater than the depths of our hatred and rebellion. And he has shown this to us by bringing Judah home. He's shown this by keeping Perez alive in famine. He has shown this by sending David and making promises to him. And ultimately, he has shown that by sending us Jesus. Jesus, who is the great son of Judah and who was God's plan of salvation all along. Now, the journey home won't be an easy one. All of us, every single one of us, we have wandered off far. We have journeyed into the darkness. And the only way home is through an honest confrontation with ourselves and our own righteousness. But there is a way home. And the destination is sure. Because this is a journey that is filled with. It is a journey that is guided by the unfailing grace of God. And that grace will lead us home. Amen.